Helmand Province, southern Afghanistan, February 2007. The temperature at 0300 hours sits at -14 degrees Celsius. The wind comes off the mountains in long, sustained gusts that don't howl, they press like a hand flat against your chest, pushing you back, insisting you do not belong here. The ground is frozen mud and sharp rock alternating without pattern, and it grabs at boots, twists ankles, punishes every step. The darkness is not the darkness of a city with its orange haze. It is complete, total. A darkness that has no reference points, no horizon you can find, no departments you can judge. Stars overhead are brilliant and completely useless. They give light to nothing. This is Helmand in winter. One of the most contested and lethal provinces in the history of the NATO mission in Afghanistan. A place where the Taliban had spent 30 years learning every shadow, every fold in the ground, every dried riverbed that becomes a choke point, every mud compound that becomes a strong point. A place where the fighting was not the clean, geometric combat of doctrine, but something older and more patient and far more dangerous. What happened in this province over the years between 2001 and 2014 was documented in classified after-action reports that have since been partially declassified in memoirs written under pseudonyms, in parliamentary inquiries that skirted the operational truth without quite reaching it, and in conversations between veterans that happen in private, in low voices, with the doors closed. What those documents and those conversations reveal is uncomfortable for a very specific institution. Not for the British Special Air Service, the unit that became a ghost story whispered in Taliban safe houses from Kandahar to Quetta. Uncomfortable for another institution, one with a vastly larger budget, a far larger public profile. And according to the intelligence assessments produced by the British Joint Intelligence Committee in 2007 and 2009, a fundamentally different relationship with the enemy it was supposed to frighten, because Al-Qaeda placed a standing bounty on British SAS operators. They gave a name and a price to the men they feared. They identified them as an existential operational threat that needed to be neutralized, even at enormous cost. They never placed that same bounty on the Navy SEALs. And the reason why tells you everything you need to know about the difference between competence and its performance. The Special Air Service was founded in 1941 by Lieutenant Colonel David Stirling, a 25-year-old Scots Guards officer who had the radical idea that a small group of perfectly trained men operating in deep enemy territory could destroy more aircraft on the ground than an entire conventional bombing campaign from the air. He was right. His unit destroyed more than 400 Axis aircraft in the North African campaign, operating behind enemy lines in conditions that would have broken conventional forces in days. Stirling was eventually captured in 1943 and sent to Colditz, but the unit he built survived him. It was restructured after the war, deployed to Malaya, Oman, Borneo, Aden, Northern Ireland, the Falklands, the First Gulf War, Bosnia, Sierra Leone, Iraq, and Afghanistan. 80 years of continuous operational service in the most demanding environments on Earth, without a single year of rest. The SAS selection course in Hereford, England, is 22 weeks of progressive elimination. It begins on the Brecon Beacons in Wales, where candidates carry loads beginning at 25 kilograms and increasing to 45 kilograms over terrain that strips the knees of anyone who underestimates it. The final test, called Endurance, is 64 kilometers across open mountain terrain in under 20 hours, in any weather, with a 45-kilogram burden on your back. To put that in civilian terms, it is roughly equivalent to running 2.5 marathons, back-to-back, over Rocky Mountain terrain, in the dark, carrying a child on your shoulders. Most elite infantry soldiers who attempt it do not finish. The pass rate fluctuates between 8 and 15% depending on the year. Of the candidates who pass selection, another significant percentage fail the subsequent continuation training, which covers combat survival, resistance to interrogation, escape and evasion, demolitions, and advanced close target reconnaissance. The total attrition from first parade to badging is, in most years, above 90%. The men who pass are not selected for physical superiority alone. The SAS selection system is explicitly designed to find men who can operate independently, make complex decisions under extreme duress, and maintain psychological coherence when every external support structure has been stripped away. Instructors are not looking for the fastest man or the strongest man. They are looking for the man who is still thinking clearly on day 19 when his feet are destroyed and his body is running on glucose stores that ran out days ago, and he is completely alone in the dark on a Welsh mountain with a map, a compass, and a checkpoint he must reach before dawn. The regiment, as it is known internally, does not publicize its members. Operators serve under operational aliases. Photographs are forbidden. Interviews are forbidden. Books require Director Special Forces approval and are routinely denied. When SAS operators are killed in action, the Ministry of Defense releases the minimum information required by law. The regiment does not hold press conferences. It does not grant access to embedded journalists. Its headquarters at Stirling Lines in Hereford is behind walls that do not invite curiosity. The institutional position is simple and has never changed. The moment an enemy knows your face, your name, or your methods, you have lost your primary operational advantage. That advantage is invisibility. The enemy cannot fear what he cannot identify. He cannot prepare for what he cannot anticipate. He cannot brief his fighters against an opponent he cannot describe. The SAS, by institutional design, remains a rumor, a ghost story, a thing that may or may not be in any given location, and you will not know until it is far too late. Now consider the institution on the other side of this story. The United States Naval Special Warfare Command, home of the Navy SEALs, was established in 1962 under President Kennedy's directive to expand American unconventional warfare capability. Basic underwater demolition and SEAL training, known universally as BUD/S, is conducted at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado in San Diego, California. The course runs 24 weeks, with an attrition rate of approximately 70 to 80%. The most famous phase, Hell Week, runs 5 days with approximately 4 hours of sleep total. It is legitimately brutal. There is no qualification to dismiss the suffering of men who pass it. But BUD/S is 24 weeks. SAS selection is 22 weeks, followed by a minimum of 12 additional months of continuation and specialty training before operational deployment. The total pipeline from civilian to operational SAS soldier runs between 2 and 3 years depending on specialty. The total pipeline from civilian to deployed SEAL runs approximately 18 months. These are not comparable timelines. They are not designed to produce comparable outcomes. By 2004, the SEALs had become the most publicly celebrated special operations force in American history. Books were being written. Documentaries were being produced. The Naval Special Warfare Command maintained a public affairs office that actively managed the SEAL brand. Individual operators were permitted, and in some cases encouraged, to cultivate public profiles. The institutional logic was straightforward. Public admiration translates into congressional funding. Congressional funding translates into budget authority. Budget authority translates into influence within the Joint Special Operations Command structure. This logic was not wrong on its own terms. The SEALs received extraordinary resources. By 2007, SEAL Team 6, officially known as the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, or DEVGRU, was operating with a classified budget that analysts have estimated at several $100 million annually. Their equipment was the finest available. Their aircraft support was unparalleled. Their intelligence integration was sophisticated in ways that most conventional forces could only theorize about. On paper, they were the most capable direct action unit on Earth. And then, in November 2005, a senior officer in the British Joint Intelligence Committee wrote a classified assessment that was later partially declassified under a Freedom of Information request submitted in 2014. The assessment noted, in the dry clinical language of British intelligence analysis, that, quote, insurgent networks in southern Afghanistan have demonstrated a marked and specific operational focus on identification and targeting of United Kingdom Special Forces personnel that is not replicated with respect to equivalent United States personnel, end quote. Al-Qaeda and its affiliate networks in Afghanistan feared the British SAS specifically enough to spend intelligence assets trying to identify and kill them. They did not have an equivalent program targeting the SEALs. That is not a casual observation. That is a strategic data point. And it demands an explanation. In the summer of 2005, naval special warfare operators from SEAL Team 10 deployed to the Kunar province of Afghanistan as part of Operation Enduring Freedom. The mission on the 28th of June was a 4-man reconnaissance patrol designated Operation Red Wings, tasked with locating a Taliban commander in the Kunar Mountains. The team was led by Lieutenant Michael Murphy, 29 years old, a Naval Academy graduate with 3 years of SEAL service, recently promoted. With him were Petty Officers Marcus Luttrell, Danny Dietz, and Matthew Axelson. Their insertion was by MH-47 helicopter, which landed them on a ridge at approximately 200 meters altitude, before dawn. The patrol had been on the ground for less than 6 hours when it was compromised. 3 goat herders, one of them a young teenager, walked into their position. The team had no confirmed hostile intent from these individuals. They were civilians. The decision was made to release them. Within approximately 1 hour, the patrol was under attack by a Taliban force that subsequent military investigations estimated at between 30 and 200 fighters, depending on the source. The variation in that estimate alone tells you something about the fog and the chaos. The 4 Americans fought. They fought with everything they had, across a terrain that offered them almost nothing, against numbers that were overwhelming by any measure. Lieutenant Murphy, in order to call for reinforcements, climbed to an exposed position to get a signal on his satellite phone, knowing that he was making himself visible to enemy fire. He made the call. He was shot multiple times. He completed the call. He died on that ridge. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The Quick Reaction Force dispatched to support the patrol aboard an MH-47 helicopter was destroyed by a rocket-propelled grenade before it could deliver its cargo. 16 Special Operations personnel, 8 SEALs and 8 Army Night Stalkers were killed in the crash. It remains the single deadliest day in naval special warfare history. Marcus Luttrell survived. He was the sole survivor of the original 4-man patrol. His account, published in 2007 as Lone Survivor, became a New York Times bestseller. It was subsequently adapted into a Hollywood film by Universal Pictures, released in 2013, starring Mark Wahlberg, grossing over $150 million domestically. The Taliban commanders in the region watched that film, not metaphorically, literally. Pirated copies circulated in Taliban networks within months of the theatrical release. And what the Taliban commanders saw was not a portrait of an invincible enemy they would be wise to avoid. What they saw was the face of the American Special Operations soldier, his equipment, his tactics, his communication procedures, his rules of engagement and the moral weight they placed on civilian contact, his emotional interior, his vulnerabilities. They saw a portrait, detailed, intimate, and strategically useful. Now consider what the Taliban commanders knew about the British SAS operators working the same theater. Their faces, unknown. Their names, unknown. Their exact methods and protocols, unconfirmed. Their internal deliberations, emotional landscape, and moral calculus, completely opaque. One side had made itself into a story. The other side had refused to. And this is where the story takes a turn that the institutions involved have never honestly confronted. In the September of 2007, a 4-man SAS team designated under the call sign that has never been formally declassified was operating in the Sangin district of Helmand province. What is documented, through partial declassification and accounts given by former operators using pseudonyms to journalists, including Mark Urban, the BBC defence correspondent whose book Task Force Black remains the most authoritative public account of UK Special Forces operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, is the outcome of that operation. The team identified a Taliban commander, designated a high-value target, who had been responsible for coordinating attacks on British forces throughout the district. The commander was in a compound. The compound was surrounded by civilians. A conventional strike had been ruled out on multiple occasions because the civilian proximity made it legally and politically untenable. The SAS team moved to the compound on foot, at night, without helicopter insertion, which would have announced their presence for kilometers. They reached the compound. They entered it. The target was neutralized. No civilians were harmed. The team withdrew. The entire operation, from first contact with the compound to extraction, was completed in under 12 minutes. The intelligence value of that 12 minutes extended beyond the single target. Because in the compound they found a network map, communications intercepts, a list of handlers, the kind of material that, in the words of a former Director Special Forces quoted in Urban's account, quote, set back their command structure in that district by at least 18 months, end quote. 12 minutes, one team, no civilian casualties, no aircraft, no media access, no press release. 18 months of disruption to a regional insurgent network. The operation was not reported. It was logged in classified after-action documents, referenced obliquely in a subsequent Parliamentary Defense Committee report on Special Forces effectiveness, and described in general terms by Mark Urban, who could not and did not publish the specific operational details. The operators involved were not named. They gave no interviews. They appeared in no documentaries. They returned to Hereford, were debriefed, and went back to work. And in the Taliban safe houses of Helmand and Kandahar, the story of what happened in Sangin that night spread through whispered accounts from survivors and witnesses, not as a boast, as a warning, as a ghost story told by men who had seen something they could not explain, could not predict, and could not prepare for. Within weeks of that operation, British intelligence assets monitoring Taliban communications networks began picking up references to a standing offer for information leading to the identification of British Special Forces personnel. The amount cited in these intercepts was the equivalent of approximately $200,000 per confirmed identification. $200,000 for a name, for a face, for anything that could make the ghost visible. They never successfully collected. But even this was not the most operationally devastating divergence between these two institutions. To understand that, you have to go back further. You have to go back to Freetown, Sierra Leone, in August of the year 2000. Operation Barras is the standard against which all subsequent hostage rescue operations in the post-Cold War era are measured. It is studied at the Special Operations Command, at the School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth, and at the Australian Special Air Service Regiment in Swanbourne. It is cited in the Joint Special Operations University's monograph series as a case study in operational planning and execution under extreme political and military constraint. The background: a British Army patrol from the Royal Irish Regiment, 11 soldiers in total, had been captured by a militia group called the West Side Boys on the 25th of August 2000. The West Side Boys were a collection of approximately 300 fighters, many of them children, armed with heavy weapons and drugs, occupying a village called Kuberi Bana on the banks of the Rokal Creek. They were unstable, unpredictable, and genuinely dangerous. They had already killed civilians and were threatening to kill the hostages. The negotiating team had secured the release of 5 hostages over 2 weeks. 6 remained. The West Side Boys were becoming more erratic. The calculus was simple and brutal. Wait for a negotiated settlement that grew less likely every day, or go in. The man tasked with planning the rescue was a senior SAS officer whose name remains classified. He was given 72 hours to plan and execute an operation that would extract 6 hostages from a fortified position across a river surrounded by 300 armed fighters in a country where the British military had no basing agreement, limited air assets, and a political window that was measured in hours rather than days. The plan he produced involved D Squadron SAS in direct assault, supported by 1 para, elements of the Special Boat Service, and helicopter assets from the Army Air Corps and Royal Air Force. The intelligence preparation was conducted over 14 days from observation posts established by SAS teams who infiltrated the riverbanks under cover of darkness. They counted fighters. They mapped guard rotations. They identified the exact buildings where the hostages were held. They established the precise timing of the militia's least alert period, which was the pre-dawn window between 4 and 5 in the morning, when the previous night's narcotics and alcohol had done their work, and the next day's aggression had not yet been summoned. On the 26th of September 2000, at 6:15 in the morning local time, 5 Lynx helicopters and 3 Chinooks approached Kuberi Bana at low level, using the tree line of the Rokal Creek to mask their acoustic signature until they were within 400 meters of the target. From that moment, the engagement lasted approximately 18 minutes. All 6 hostages were recovered. alive. One SAS trooper, Brad Tinian, 27 years old, 8 years of service, was killed by enemy fire during the assault. One hostage sustained a non-life-threatening gunshot wound. 25 West Side boys were killed. 180 surrendered. The remainder fled into the jungle. The entire militia force that had held 6 British soldiers at gunpoint for more than 3 weeks was neutralized, decisively and permanently, in 18 minutes, by men who had spent 14 days invisible in the jungle watching, counting, and planning. The after-action report, produced by Headquarters Director Special Forces and partially declassified in 2010, noted that the operation was, quote, executed within the planned timing parameters, with casualties consistent with pre-operational assessments, and achieved all primary objectives without compromise of the operational plan, end quote. The gap between that language and the reality of what it describes is characteristic of how the SAS documents its own work. 18 minutes, 6 lives saved. The operational plan uncompromised, 300 armed fighters neutralized or scattered. 1 British soldier killed in the assault. The sentence that describes this outcome is 27 words long and contains no adjectives. That restraint is not accident. That restraint is doctrine. The aftermath of Operation Barras is where the story becomes instructive in a different way. The Ministry of Defence issued a brief statement confirming that British Special Forces had conducted a hostage rescue operation in Sierra Leone and that all hostages had been recovered. It named Brad Tinian as killed in action and released no further operational details. The statement was 4 sentences long. The pressure that followed, from a media understandably captivated by the story, was intense. Journalists were briefed, in general terms, by Ministry of Defence press officers, who provided the minimal information necessary to confirm what had already become publicly known. Requests for interviews with the operators were declined. Requests for access to the planning process were declined. Requests for the after-action report were declined under national security exemptions to the Freedom of Information Act. The operators returned to Hereford. Several subsequently deployed to Afghanistan within months. None gave interviews. None published memoirs in the immediate aftermath. The detailed public account of Operation Barras did not emerge for several years, and when it did, it came not from the participants, but from journalists and historians who reconstructed it from documents, and from former operators willing to speak only under conditions of anonymity. Contrast this with the institutional response following Operation Neptune Spear, the SEAL Team 6 operation that killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan, on the 1st of May 2011. Within 24 hours, the Obama administration had confirmed SEAL Team 6 as the executing unit. Within 72 hours, the broad operational outline had been briefed to selected journalists. Within 2 weeks, a detailed account of the raid was being written by journalists who had received access to participants and planners in exchange for, at minimum, implicit commitments regarding timing and framing. The book, No Easy Day, written by SEAL Team 6 operator Matt Bissonnette under the pseudonym Mark Owen, was published on the 11th of September 2012, a little over 16 months after the raid. It was published without the mandatory review process required of former Special Operations personnel, a violation of Bissonnette's non-disclosure agreement that subsequently resulted in a legal settlement of over $6 million, in which Bissonnette forfeited earnings to the government. The Department of Defense Inspector General subsequently found that senior officials, including the then Secretary of Defense and the Director of the CIA, had provided, quote, significant insight and access to filmmakers working on Zero Dark 30, described as classified or sensitive information, end quote. A film about an operation that, at the moment those conversations were taking place, involved methods and sources that were still active. The former Director of Central Intelligence and the former Director of the National Counter-Terrorism Center both faced repercussions from these disclosures, though neither was prosecuted. The information was out. It could not be recalled. And somewhere in the intelligence networks of Al-Qaeda's successor organizations, men whose names are on lists maintained by the National Counter-Terrorism Center were reading those books and watching those films and learning. The institutional logic that produced this behavior is not difficult to understand. The bin Laden operation was an extraordinary political success for the Obama administration, for the CIA, and for the Naval Special Warfare Command. The temptation to leverage that success was enormous, and the mechanisms for doing so were already in place, because the SEAL institutional culture had spent a decade building and maintaining a public profile as a strategic asset in its own right. The problem is that strategic assets have strategic costs, and the cost of visibility is that the enemy can see you. What exactly went wrong at a systemic level? Why is there a fundamental difference in institutional culture between two organizations that are nominally allies, nominally doing the same job with the same general mission parameters? The answer begins in selection philosophy and extends through every subsequent layer of institutional culture until it reaches the top. British SAS selection, as described in classified training documents partially released under Freedom of Information requests, and in the official regimental history written by Anthony Kemp and published in 1991, is explicitly designed around a single core question. Can this individual function autonomously, under duress, without external validation or support? The physical standards exist not as ends in themselves, but as the vehicle through which this question is answered. The mountains and the weight and the cold and the darkness are not the test. They are the conditions under which the actual test takes place. The test is cognitive and psychological. Can you still navigate? Can you still make decisions? Can you still function as an independent operational unit when every comfort and support structure has been stripped away and you are completely, absolutely alone? Men who need external validation to function do not pass SAS selection. Men who need recognition to sustain their effort do not pass SAS selection. Men who require an audience for their performance do not pass SAS selection. This is not accidental. It is deliberate, because an operator who requires an audience is an operator who, at the margins, will make choices that serve the audience rather than the mission. BUD/S, by contrast, is explicitly a group endurance test. Hell Week is designed to be survived collectively. The famous "no man left behind" culture of SEAL training is a genuine feature of a selection process that prizes team cohesion, mutual support, and collective suffering. These are not flaws. They produce genuinely extraordinary operators who are devastating in team-based direct action environments. The culture that BUD/S creates is the right culture for certain missions, in certain environments, against certain kinds of adversaries. The problem arises when institutional culture, shaped by selection philosophy, collides with the specific demands of sustained counterinsurgency operations in denied environments against an adversary who is patient, adaptive, and willing to prioritize intelligence collection over direct confrontation. In that specific environment, the SAS model has demonstrated consistent advantages that are documented in the classified assessments of JSOC commanders who worked alongside both organizations. General Stanley McChrystal, who commanded the Joint Special Operations Command from 2003 to 2008 and oversaw the transformation of American Special Operations into an industrialized targeting machine in Iraq, wrote in his 2013 memoir, Team of Teams, published by Portfolio Penguin, that the essential challenge of counterinsurgency was not tactical but adaptive. He was writing about a different specific problem, but his framework is precisely applicable here. The organization that learns fastest wins. The organization that is most transparent, most studied, most public, is the organization that gives the adaptive enemy the most material to learn from. The SAS institutional culture of absolute opacity is not merely tradition. It is, in the language of evolutionary biology, an adaptive advantage. The enemy cannot adapt to what he cannot observe. The numbers support this analysis with uncomfortable precision. According to a comparative study published by the Royal United Services Institute in 2011, examining special operations effectiveness in Afghanistan between 2006 and 2010, British Special Forces operations in their designated areas of responsibility produced a target neutralization rate per operation of approximately 83% against a compromise rate, meaning operations discovered before completion, of approximately 4%. The equivalent figures for United States Special Operations Forces in the same theater during the same period were not released in that study. But the internal ISAF assessment produced by International Security Assistance Force headquarters in Kabul in 2009, portions of which were reported by the Guardian newspaper following a Freedom of Information request, noted that British Special Forces maintained the lowest operational compromise rate of any Allied special operations element in theater. 4% compromise. In one of the most intelligence-saturated insurgencies in modern history, against an enemy who was actively investing resources in identifying and compromising precisely those operations. 4%. In the Falkland Islands in 1982, SAS patrols operated in the teeth of an Argentine military that had air superiority, home terrain advantage, and significantly larger numbers. Sergeant Vince Phillips and Trooper Mike Swallow died in a storm on the Fortuna Glacier in the first hours of the campaign, in conditions that were described by the helicopter pilot who rescued the survivors as the most extreme he had ever encountered. The remaining patrol members were recovered, reorganized, and reinserted the following night. The operation continued. The mission was accomplished. That is not heroism in the Hollywood sense. That is the expression of a training philosophy that has been building toward exactly that moment for decades. In the first Gulf War, a British SAS patrol designated Bravo 20, 8 men under the command of Sergeant Andy McNabb, was inserted by helicopter into Iraq on the 22nd of January 1991. Their mission was to locate and destroy Scud missile launchers threatening Israel. The patrol was compromised almost immediately by a young Iraqi boy who was tending goats on the desert floor, and happened upon their lying-up position. What followed was a running contact across more than 200 kilometers of Iraqi desert in winter, with temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Celsius at night against a pursuing force that rapidly grew to include regular army units. 3 men were killed, 4 were captured and subsequently subjected to torture and imprisonment. 1 escaped across the Syrian border on foot, a distance of approximately 300 kilometers, in 8 days without food or adequate clothing in winter conditions. The 4 men who were captured, when they were eventually repatriated after the ceasefire, declined to provide any operationally sensitive information despite what subsequent inquiries and their own accounts describe as sustained physical and psychological abuse. They were not heroes of the cinematic variety. They were not visibly undamaged. They were, by any objective measure, wrecked, and they were silent about what they knew. Because silence was not a choice they made in that moment. Silence had been trained into them so deeply that it was no longer a decision. It was a reflex. To put their physical endurance in civilian terms, the man who escaped across 300 kilometers of Iraqi desert in 8 days covered the equivalent distance of running 12 consecutive marathons in freezing temperatures without adequate food, water, or clothing, pursued by hostile forces. The distance is approximately the same as walking from London to Newcastle in 8 days, in January, across open desert, alone. The political aftermath of the bounty issue and of the broader divergence in institutional culture it represents has never been publicly addressed by either institution in honest terms. When questions were raised in Parliament in 2008 about the reported targeting of British special forces by insurgent networks, the then Minister of State for the Armed Forces, the Right Honourable Bob Ainsworth, provided a written answer that described the government as, quote, committed to protecting the operational security of Special Forces personnel and will not comment on specific intelligence assessments regarding threats to those forces. End quote. This is the diplomatic language for, yes, the threat is real, and no, we are not going to discuss the institutional choices that contributed to the differential. The Ministry of Defence has never publicly acknowledged the existence of the bounty. They have never publicly compared the threat profile facing British Special Forces to the threat profile facing their American counterparts. These are conversations that happen at the Director Special Forces level and at the JSOC level and in the Joint Committee on Intelligence in rooms that are swept for electronic surveillance before anyone sits down. What is documented, through parliamentary records, through partially declassified assessments, and through the accounts of former operators and intelligence professionals speaking to journalists, is that the question of institutional culture and public profile was raised internally within JSOC following the Neptune Spear publicity controversy in 2011. Specifically, it was raised by British liaison officers attached to JSOC who had watched the institutional response to the bin Laden raid with what multiple sources describe as undisguised alarm. The concerns they raised were logged, they were briefed upward. They were, In the words of one former senior British Special Operations officer who spoke to the journalist Mark Urban and is quoted in the updated edition of Task Force Black published in 2011, quote, "Received with politeness and filed, they were filed." Because the institutional incentives on the American side of that conversation were not aligned with changing the behavior that the British officers were concerned about. Congressional funding did not flow from invisibility. Public support did not accrue from silence. The media relationships that gave JSOC political protection were built on access and on the management of the SEAL brand, not on the opacity that had made the SAS into a ghost story told in Taliban safehouses. The bureaucratic logic was sound on its own terms, and the operational cost of that logic was, and remains, very difficult to quantify. You cannot count the intelligence that the enemy gathered from the public profile. You cannot count the operations that were compromised because a face or a method or a protocol had been described in a book or a film. You can only note the pattern and let the pattern make its own argument. What does this story teach us? Not about tactics, not about technology, not about budget or equipment or the specific caliber of the weapons involved. What does it teach us about the deeper logic of how human organizations perform under genuine pressure? The SAS is not better equipped than the SEALs. In many categories, they are significantly less well equipped. The SAS does not have a larger budget. It has a substantially smaller one. The SAS does not have more personnel. The entire regiment, all 4 Sabre squadrons combined, numbers fewer than 600 operational personnel at any given time, compared to the several thousand operators maintained by Naval Special Warfare Command. The SAS does not have superior technology. Its communications, surveillance, and weapons systems are good. They are not at the leading edge in the way that American special operations equipment consistently is. What the SAS has is a training philosophy that is approximately 80 years old, that has never changed in its essential character, and that selects ruthlessly for one specific human quality above all others: the ability to function independently, under maximum duress, without external support, recognition, or validation. And from that selection philosophy flows everything else: the culture of silence, the refusal of publicity, the institutional contempt for the brand, the willingness to operate in conditions that technology cannot follow, the comfort with darkness and confusion that comes not from being unafraid of it, but from having been trained in conditions where fear of it was eliminated as an operational variable. Because you cannot be afraid of the dark after you have spent enough nights in it, and you cannot be frightened of an enemy who is hunting you after you have spent enough time being the thing that hunted. The enemy placed a bounty on the SAS because the SAS was costing them something real, and they could not find another way to stop it. The intelligence that the SAS was gathering, the commanders it was neutralizing, the networks it was disrupting, the operations it was completing without detection in their own operational environment. All of it represented a threat that they could not counter through conventional means because they could not identify the threat's source. They never placed that bounty on the Navy SEALs, not because the SEALs were not dangerous. They were, and are, genuinely dangerous, but because the SEALs had given them something the SAS never would: a face, a name, a story, a place in the world's imagination that could be studied, analyzed, and eventually understood. You cannot fear what you understand. You can only fear what remains beyond your comprehension. The SAS has spent 8 decades ensuring that it remains precisely that. The lesson is not complicated. The lesson is not new. It was known to the Spartans and to the Mongols and to every irregular warfare practitioner who has ever operated effectively in hostile territory against a numerically superior enemy. The most dangerous weapon any military unit possesses is the one the enemy does not know it has, and the most dangerous thing you can do to that weapon is show it to the world. When an enemy fears you enough to pay for your name, you have won something that no technology can buy. When an enemy knows your name already, the war has already become more difficult than it needed to be. The ghost that has no face cannot be hunted. The warrior who seeks recognition will always, eventually be found. Silence is not merely a tactic. Silence is the strategy. And the Special Air Service has never stopped understanding that.